So, Adrian, the Dutch audiences that you were cultivating, how did that happen?
Okay, so there were two things that happened that opened up Holland to me. And it's worth explaining just quickly here to our audience that you've got your really huge bands and artists who are global in every sense of the word. So they're every continent, most countries, they are known and they've got huge audiences. But then there's loads and loads of levels under that in terms of artists, singer-songwriters, bands that make a perfectly reasonable career out of music making, but don't necessarily have that global exposure. One of the keys to that is to open up a territory.
Right.
Lots of artists, for example, are, they do well in Europe, but they're completely unknown in America.
Okay.
And then, K-pop is a fantastic example. It's now becoming global, but until relatively recently, K-pop, as in Korean pop, huge in Korea. millions and millions of sales and vast audiences that people in the rest of the world had never heard of. As I said, we're beginning to now because they're just great, so many of those acts.
Right.
So territory is really important. So that's the background to this, is that two things happened. I had an invitation out of the blue to do a concert in Holland supporting another artist who was quite well known over there. We had a fantastic full house audience in Arnhem Town Hall. The concert was a massive success. And there's nothing like a really successful concert for word to spread.
Yeah.
So that was one thing, but by far the more significant thing was that I was invited to perform on a television show in Holland that at the time, more than 3/4 of the population watched. A little bit like in my earlier days, programs like Nationwide, if you remember that. So like the one show, but actually huge.
Yeah.
Everybody would turn on this sort of early evening program. And I didn't know that, but that's what I was invited onto. And such was the size of the audience. And again, it appeared to be quite a successful 2 songs that I sang. Such was the size of the audience. When I got to the airport the next day, Schiphol Airport, people were saying, "Oh, saw you on the television last night," and checking, "Oh, weren't you that person?"
Wow, fantastic.
So what that did was, it laid the ground for my work in Holland. And of course that wasn't enough to sustain it, but what you also got with the Dutch, if they like you, they stay with you. There's an immense loyalty from the Dutch people.
How interesting.
And so all these years later, when I'm touring there in October, it's not like it was, of course, but I nevertheless still have a very committed audience in Holland. And that became, in a way, what I was saying about territory, the territory for me. Holland and a few other countries around, became an incredibly important part, not just of me performing each year, but of generating income,
right,
which obviously is vital if you're to sustain your career.
Of course. Other early albums followed.
Yes.
Sort of leading to one of your biggest works, The Passion. So how did that evolve?
Okay, so The Passion, the first songs that ended up on the Passion were on my very first ever album, Fireflake. So that this album that I went to record after this time at Lee Abbey was the second side. The album was called Fireflake. The second side was 5 songs, and they became 5 of the songs that ended up on the Passion. What happened, spinning forward another 4 or 5 years, is that a production company that the Christian record company I was signed to had some sort of a relationship with. They produced some of their artists. They heard some of my material. They were interested in working with me. And then they heard this original Passion on Fireflake. And they said, that's amazing material. Have you ever thought about doing it again? Or remaking it, but with a lot more?
Right.
And to cut a long story short, it was an amazing period of time that over the next 2 years, I wrote more material to supplement what was there. They took on the production, and with their connections and their commitment, so they were prepared to put up 50% of the budget for it, it suddenly opened up a completely new world of musicians.
Wow.
And I remember the day when I was in the studio and they were talking about the album, where they wanted to take it. They were talking about getting a hold of Simon Phillips, who's still one of the world's best drummers, and then listing all these musicians that they wanted on it. And then came the we're wondering about, on the sort of more classical orchestral side, we're wondering about approaching the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra.
Yeah. Wow.
I don't know, I was 20, what was I, 21, 22. I was just astonished. Hadn't even occurred to me that you could do that, but if you've got the money and the orchestra agrees to do something like that, yes, of course it's possible. And so they did. And what then happened was that we completed the album. We knew that we had something very special. The one frustration that crept in at that time, and it reflects something we've talked about earlier, was this conflict between the demands, if I can put it that way, of the Christian music world and the perspective of the mainstream. Right. So what happened here is the Christian recording company, who'd put in a lot of money, just wanted it out there to their audience. They wanted a tour, and they wanted the album to sell,
right.
Recoup some of that money.
Of course.
The mainstream production company, who had by far the bigger, longer view, were, well, no, there's no rush. In fact, the last thing you want to do when you've just put together something this special is to rush it out. The promotion and the marketing is the all-important thing.
Totally.
And it became more than a frustration. It became a real conflict between the two sides.
That's a shame. Yeah.
What we did get, which helped, was interest from BBC Radio, and they produced this wonderful program that became the premiere of the work. Good Friday, 1980, The Passion was broadcast with a narration done by the actress Eunice Stubbs, right. who played the part of Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
So that at least got the word out there. But in the end, the Christian recording company kind of got their way. And I think the lesson through all of that, therefore the disappointment slightly, is that I think had we given it time, had we let the production company take the reins when it came to marketing promotion, it could actually have been much, much bigger. Right. It did very well. The story's not over, and we're still working with it. But who knows what could have been if we hadn't been so urgent in terms of its release.
Right. But the BBC approached you then for another work, though, didn't they? That was something that happened quite quickly.
It did, and that was lovely, because this time it came from them, and along with that came a commissioning budget and stuff like that. So the pressure was much less.
Yeah.
And that was basically a BBC Radio saying, we think The Passion was a big success. We'd like to do something similar around the Christmas story, but we'd like it to have a bit of an edge.
Yeah.
Would you be interested? And of course I was. And I joined forces with my friend and co-writer Phil Thompson.
Fantastic.
And we came up with The Virgin,
yeah.
which also received its premiere on BBC Radio 1.
And your brother had a narrating part on it.
My dear brother, yeah, he was a prophet. If I remember right.
Yeah.
We opened the album with these Old Testament prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. over this swirling soundscape.
Yeah, remarkable.
And he was one of them with his lovely British, and it came to pass, you know, all that stuff. But yeah, it was nice. It's the only time I ever had my brother on a recording.
And the live premiere, wasn't it at Greenbelt at a festival in terrible weather?
Yes, which does have fascinating, disturbing even memories. Twofold. One, because it was dreadful. The weather was really dreadful. It was a storm. I mean, the wind was, but also because we had a costume designer. You know, not surprisingly, there were those involved in all this stuff that actually wanted it to look really interesting too. If you're doing a live version of this story of the coming of Jesus into the world, you don't really just want to be a bunch of artists up there singing. You don't want to look. You know.
Yeah.
So the designer decided to cloak, especially these prophets, in cloaks and sort of headdress things. And in hindsight, it looked very much like Ku Klux Klan. Dreadful association. Couldn't be worse, really. But of course, with wind as well. So you had sort of Wuthering Heights elements to it. And people had lots of notes because they were thinking, and they were just blowing, you know. So not my happiest memory.
No, not at all, no.
But so an interesting sort of launch alongside BBC Radio 1, which is a little bit easier to handle.
For sure. An album that people sort of relate to, and it was very popular, was called Feed the Hungry Heart.
Mm.
That was, and I think, didn't Princess Di, didn't she love that album? And you had a sort of connection with her.
Yeah, so she didn't sing on it, let's be
clear.
No,
she wasn't a musician, no.
So the story around that is, the album had been out for quite some time. I was invited, this may sound a bit of an odd sequitur, but a lot of charities like to invite artists to help promote their cause. And I was invited by the Leprosy Mission to do something around the people they work with to bring attention to my audience in this country. That was the idea. Okay. So they took me out to India and Nepal to see their work. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that out of that I'd write some material, some songs that we would then introduce in a concert format with interview and spread the word about the Leprosy Mission. Right. Turned out that the Leprosy Mission also succeeded in getting Princess Diana to become one of their patrons, which is a big thing. I mean, not least because it was Princess Diana, but also because she was quite selective. And in fact, in her latter years, she'd, I think, limited it to 5, something like that, of which the Leprosy Mission was one. Right. So it held an important place in her heart. And she was filmed going to the same places that I'd gone. And I remember people particularly noticing her incredible natural way with that disease, as she had shown people with AIDS, as a way of saying, look, you don't pick up leprosy just by touching somebody. You know, it's like she broke through something very important in terms of understanding the nature of the disease. And then what happened was, as part of this association with the Leprosy Mission, I was invited to play at a very special event at Peterborough Cathedral that she was going to attend. And I sang Feed the Hungry Heart. And it turned out that she loved the song and she wanted to meet me. And we had a brief but lovely conversation about the song and about the context and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then I did perform once more a couple of years later at an event in London that she attended. I didn't speak to her again, but what I have become aware of, let's put it that way, is that she showed interest in my material from that start point. And probably through the Leprosy Mission, through the director of the Leprosy Mission, she was able to get my albums, or some of my albums. And the story came, and it's probably what you're referring to, that after her death, Paul Gambaccini did a sort of an audit kind of her record collection. Right. And they found several of my albums, and that led to quite an interesting story that hit headlines for just a few days. You know, who the hell is Adrian Snell kind of thing. Why has Princess Diana got his material? And so a few minutes of interesting exposure in things. I think it was Sunday Times and Daily Express and stuff like that. Okay. But that's what lay behind that.
You toured in Germany not long after, I think, didn't it? That led to another work, of course. Could you talk a little bit about that?
You're thinking Alpha and Omega?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, so how to summarise this? I did tour in Germany. This was at a stage in my personal life, my personal journey and journey of faith, when I was beginning to ask a lot more questions about, what shall I say really, about Christian history, about how we as a nation have become what we've become, about recent history and about Christian attitudes. It was a whole bunch of stuff, but sure. Central to that, at that point for me, was a deep, deep journey into the Holocaust and trying to understand what had happened there, why, and incredibly importantly, I think, how it was that there were many people within the sort of theological world who had developed this deep dislike of Jewish people, this deep distrust, and this sense in which some of what took place was almost inevitable because of the Jews' responsibility for the death of Jesus. Really mixed theological stuff that I found very disturbing, and began to read things that people like Martin Luther had said that were desperately disturbing about the reality of Jewish people and almost a suggestion that they barely deserved to be around. Anyway, I was studying this stuff and thinking a lot about it. And I realized during this tour in Germany that several of the places that we were performing were very close to sites of former concentration camps, one of them in particular being Bergen-Belsen. So after one of the concerts I was doing in Germany, which was actually at a British Army base, literally 5 kilometers from former Bergen-Belsen, I asked if before we went on to the next place I could go. And I went there and spent a couple of hours, and they were life-changing because it's just very hard to explain what happened there, but it was a revelation to me. It was a sense of hearing and feeling God's heart over what had taken place, that sort of cry that God made to Cain, where is your brother? Innocent blood has been shed here. And just beginning to sense something about the place of history and that God doesn't forget that we may be walking apart, over land where there's the blood of millions and it's forgotten, it's gone, there's trees there now. But God doesn't forget, and he sees. And I was trying to make sense of all that.
Of course.
Cut a long story short, but it's not really cutting it short. It's not long enough already. To get to the point, it started the journey that led to the writing of this work of mine, Alpha and Omega, which begins with a piece called Kaddish for Bergen-Belsen. And that did become life-changing for me because it was the first time I'd stepped into the territory of, I suppose, writing something with a prophetic element to it, really seeking to hear what was God's voice in all of this, what was he saying to us now, also addressing the past. And then the fact that I got invited by a very significant group of people who were praying and thinking about the same things to premiere the work in Jerusalem, which suddenly brought loads of other things together. It also meant I was able to go to Yad Vashem, which is the Jewish memorial to the Holocaust. That was a life-changing experience. So there I was introduced to extraordinary range of ways of remembering, and especially the children of the Holocaust, of whom 1.5 million under the age of 15 died. So these kind of figures became so real as I went to Yad Vashem. And that also led to the writing of another work of mine, Song of an Exile, later.
Yes.
But the premiere of Alpha and Omega took place in Jerusalem. And at that point, I had no idea quite how it would be received. I mean, you never do know as a composer, as an artist. You pour yourself out, you put all this work into something, and there it is, Yeah. But extraordinarily, there was a huge response to it that led to that becoming the most toured work of mine ever. So we were performing that for a year and a half all over the world.
Incredible.
And that was very humbling. There was also that sense in which actually this is what God wants to say to his, you know, and I use those words terribly carefully. You know, we have to be so careful about claiming we've got God's view about something. But it seemed to me it was indeed resonating with people, Christian people primarily, but in many different countries, that this was what God was saying at this time. I see what you don't see, and there needs to be some waking up and some repentance and some renewal here, you know. And I think that changed also to some extent my audience's viewpoint of me, if you can see what I mean. It's like, obviously, if you come with something of that nature, people start to think about you as the voice behind it in a slightly different way. So it was a very significant period of time in my life as a composer.
And that led you onto a journey of Song of an Exile, which again was linked about the young people.
Yeah, so it's a very, very different kind of an album, but directly related in that it was the central themes or the central pieces in Song of an Exile are my settings to music of poems written by children that wrote those poems whilst they were in concentration camps and ghettos. Giving voice, I suppose, to children who had no voice other than the pen and drawings. But hugely an important part for me of the next stage in my journey. So there was almost the macro, the huge nature of what had happened, and then bringing it right down to a 13-year-old girl, a 12-year-old boy, and trying, through their eyes, trying to understand the Jewish story better, not just the story of the Holocaust, but the whole issue of the Jewish people, their relationship with God, the children of Israel, as it were, the fact that that relationship is and was extraordinary in terms of God's choice of a group of people to reveal himself through, but including the disasters and the successes and everything in between, you know. So all of that began to open up for me, and then that in turn led to City of Peace, which is another chapter.
And in between the time, obviously you sadly lost your father around the time of Song of an Exile, and then you wrote Father, the album inspired by your dad, and in fact it was my brother's favourite album of yours. Actually, he absolutely loved Father, and I do too. And Compassion was the first track, which is a sort of wonderful song, and then there's Compassion Reprise and some nice narration.
You're very well researched.
I know. In fairness, I mean, I think when I lost my brother, I couldn't play much music after I lost him because he was tragically drowned. But you know, it's only been more recently that I'm able to revisit the music and then and play and listen to your music again.
Was he a younger brother?
No, he was older. He was older than me, so 4 years older. But,
so I lost the brother we spoke about too. I'd say he was younger than me, so I understand a bit about the loss of sibling.
Sure, of course.
And my sister.
And your sister, your older sister, isn't it?
Yeah. So quite a strange position to be in when you're the only surviving member of your family. You never kind of expected that, you know.
No, you didn't know.
Anyway,
totally right. And obviously you toured with Alpha and Omega extensively. One comment I think I picked up, how much were you enjoying the success of your acceptance of the works and the sort of celebration of the works? Were you enjoying that? Were you able to enjoy it, or were you sort of in another place?
It's a good question. There was always still the frustration of not reaching the audience that I long to reach. I would say that's been a constant. Is the feeling that there's more to be had.
Right.
And I hope I'm expressing that in a non sort of entitlement or arrogant way. It is exactly what I say. It's believing that there is a potential audience out there that is much bigger potentially and broader than the audience I have, but who've never heard of either me or the music, and that's the frustration. It's not that I haven't sold 1 billion albums, it's that nobody's had the opportunity, people in these other areas of potential audience, it's not been made available to them, so they've not been able to make a choice. That's the frustration.
But even people within the church, somebody say, "Oh, Adrian Snell, oh, I think I've heard of him." Well, hang on. You should be a household name within the church, all churches, you know.
It's a very difficult tension to live with. It's like because you're very aware, first of all, that you have an enormous privilege to have an audience at all. That's a reality.
Right.
You know, the fact people will come and listen to me. But then there's your own expectations, and it's trying to discipline yourself in a way, almost to think, well, what of those expectations are justified, and at what point am I actually being unrealistic? Am I blinkered about something?
Right.
And I think that process actually continues forever.
Okay.
It's your own expectations of what you could achieve, what you have achieved. So this is coming back to your question. It's like success is an incredibly, what's the word I'm looking for? Subjective word, I think.
Okay.
In terms of how each individual perceives success. So there were those that would come to me and say, "My goodness, you know, your album, The Passion, Alpha and Omega, one of the most successful albums in, you know, Christian European business." And I'd always find it hard to look at it that way for exactly the reasons I've said. And also because of the subject matter. It's like you do know that when you make an album around a theme like the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, or in this case the prophetic words of God, to some extent your audience isn't coming just for the music, like we sort of touched on earlier on. So that's a difficult one too, because you'd love to think, actually, you know, everybody that comes to this initially comes because they just love my music. Well, that's not entirely true. Some will be coming because the message, you know, we need to hear the message. But then also in terms of album sales, you know, so if the album had sold, I don't know, 50,000 copies, that's great. But hey, hang on a minute, you know, Radiohead sold 10 million, you know, or whatever it may be. So it's like you're always, in my world, because I care about the fact of having access to a broader audience, because that matters to me. It doesn't to some people. They're quite happy to be, you know, a worship leader or whatever, and that's their audience. But it does matter to me because I'm a composer and because I want my music to be heard and enjoyed by a much broader audience. I can't help but look at those figures and think, all very well, but look at the world out there. And these days, this is where the opportunity, of course, is like never before, but also the comparisons like never before. The availability of your audience through social media is just extraordinary.
Of course.
But extraordinarily competitive. So now you could say, well, there's almost no excuse for not being able to reach anybody anywhere in the world. But of course, it's far more complicated in terms of how do you get a voice amongst the millions of people who want the same thing.
Absolutely. Kiss the Tears was a lovely album. You were sort of thinking more singer-songwriter with that, I think, maybe, and Coverdale came out of that, and Favourite Song, and other classic Adrian Snell pieces. And at that time you were moving from Leeds to Bath. Why did you move from Leeds to Bath?
The move was a long time coming. It was actually more about my wife. She just felt that our time in Leeds was over. Lots of, like any family that are thinking about a move, there's often a lot of ingredients. What it wasn't, of course, was about base for work, because I'm a musician, so you can be based anywhere. But I think from sort of cosmopolitan Leeds and living on a busy main road and all that kind of stuff, to thinking, where could we imagine home? One of the key factors was a church we discovered here in Bath that was especially welcoming to artists and people slightly disaffected with mainstream church, I suppose. I mean, it was an Anglican church, but it clearly had some oddballs in it, and we quite liked the idea of being an oddball. So that was an important ingredient, and then also the home itself. It's like you know, you were remarking on the window there. We are so fortunate to live very close to the city centre, but in an area that is completely in the midst of nature. It's green, there are trees, blah blah blah. So we made the move, have not regretted it ever since. and it's become a very different home base to explore the world from.
Solo was written here. Now that was you just playing the piano.
Yes.
No singing.
No singing.
Just some of your older pieces, purely piano. Were you thinking again, maybe targeting, I don't know, another audience with that work, or?
I think the whole journey from you mentioned Kiss the Tears and Father, but you mentioned, I think after the sort of the scale of things like Alpha and Omega and City of Peace, I think you're absolutely right. I think I was really wanting to step more back into the singer-songwriter.
Right.
That is at the heart of what I do.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like when an album becomes quite big within a certain field, that's how people identify you.
Yeah.
So there was the sort of sense of Adrian writes these big themed works. Even more strange to me was because of the nature of the work, Alpha and Omega has a lot of choir. But I was never a choral writer.
Not right.
And I absolutely did not want to be identified as a choir.
And the choirs were fantastic,
weren't
they?
They
fantastic.
were, yes.
You know.
But it wasn't sort of Adrian Snell choral artist.
No.
So I think that was another reason for stepping back into the singer-songwriter, the sort of solo voice with some backup singers, was trying to say that that's actually at the core of who I am too.
Yeah.
I'm not just writing for big choirs, you know.
Sure.
And I think the solo album came out of people, friends, trusted colleagues saying, you know, you are essentially a pianist, and the only problem sometimes about arrangements and recordings is that you move away from the core of what that piece is, which is piano.
Right, indeed.
And I resisted that for a long time, partly because I didn't think I had the material necessarily, or I don't know. And then it clicked, really. One day, it just clicked. I thought, gee, you know what? I do have enough material, particularly if I see some of the piano parts to pieces of mine as self-contained, not necessarily needing the words, added to which I have instrumental pieces and maybe some new compositions.
Right.
And I just thought to myself, that would actually be a lovely way of saying, this is also who Adrian is and where he started. Yeah. Back there as a 5-6-year-old playing the piano at home. So
and totally acceptable by everyone.
By everyone. So yes, same old thing. Recorded it. You could not, for once, possibly say this is an album just as destined for a Christian audience. But of course, once you've got the label, even if you put it out there and it's Adrian Snell solo, there'll be from many places that additional gospel artist Adrian Snell produces solo. So somehow you've still got that identification that determines in part who will give it the time of day.
Right.
But yes, of course, the intention, and when it gets heard, and that's the nice thing about the album, is it's timeless. It won't date because it's Steinway grand piano, you know.
Indeed.
And who knows, might do another one one day.
Well, that would be fantastic. And other works, obviously, I mean, you mentioned City of Peace, which was a big work, and You from that album, You is a wonderful song.
Where I Wonder You.
Where I Wonder You. What a song! You know, it's one of my very favourites.
Oh, that's lovely.
Absolutely super. Yes, so you know we're obviously moving along fairly quickly because I mean to cover 50 years in a sort of few minutes.
You've done very well.
And now Intimate Strangers was an interesting work because that again was a sort of like that was very different, wasn't it?
It's quite dark.
It's a little bit dark.
Dark and bass heavy. And
a little bit sort of difficult to get into, actually. It wasn't a typical Adrian Snell work at all.
No,
and again, almost an appeal to another audience again, maybe.
Yeah, and comes out of collaboration. So I worked with this guy, John Burt, fantastic.
Oh, yes.
Ahead of his time kind of thinking bloke, really.
Okay.
And he was, I really enjoyed the challenge. His challenge was, come on, let's explore your voice. As in, you know, most of your material is within this range. This is how you. Let's try and get you deeper. Let's try and get you singing lower.
Which comes out very
quieter, and just explore textures. But also in terms of the production values, thinking more not drum and bass per se stylistically, but in terms of that kind of tonality where you're going much more bass heavy. And you're doing interesting things with percussion. You're doing more sequencing and programming.
Interesting.
So the songs, and that's the interesting thing about songwriting and production and where it takes you, is that most of the songs were written, as all my songs have been, in a piano voice or guitar voice. And if I went back to those songs and just played them like that, they'd sound completely different, because the choice was, no, instead of just having a straightforward, let's lose the piano altogether.
Right.
And let's just replace it with this bass part and this soundscape. So experimental, yes, for a lot of my audience, quite difficult to get into. I've started listening to that, particularly specific tracks, again more recently, and I really love it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure at the time.
That's interesting.
sure
I'm similar, because I put it at the bottom of the pile somewhere,
Yeah.
and I've been listening to it more recently.
It's
And
very
actually, there's some,
Well, I'm the same.
Interesting.
You take a step like that, and of course, the first thing you get is all the negative
what's those
reactions from people. I had one close friend who said, "There's clearly a problem with my copy. The bass is just too high."
Okay.
And I had to say,
that's how it is.
It's intended that way. But yeah, it's lots of negative reactions as well as the positive ones. But hopefully, as is true with art that stands the test of time, all these years later, there are some soundscapes within that album that if I take the words away, I would easily think about reusing now.
Okay.
There's one or two specific tracks on that.
Okay.
And I just love the colours, the sounds, and could easily imagine working with that again, adding some other sounds, maybe taking it somewhere else.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that album, because it often isn't.
It's quite different. And around this time, of course, you've got a career change really starting to develop massively.
Yeah. Massively, yeah. Neurology, no. Music therapy. Well, yes. So we're coming now to late 90s, and around that time, as well as wondering about my career, as in, like lots of musicians, is this it? I mean, do I have anything else? The whole one-trick pony thing, what else is there? And that sense of, does the rest of my life involve travelling to places where people want to hear me, the recording studio, trying to make sure I'm making a living through what I do, or is there something else?
Sure.
And I think that the more concerning thing that happened around that time was a serious beginning of a loss of desire to do it. It was like that sense of tiredness with the whole, the machinery.
Sure.
Which is a horrible word to use about that, because how can you talk about making music as a machine? But it is, in the sense of, if you're going to keep a career going, that there has to be a kind of a discipline around that. And I was very tired of that. Also, and these are things that would be more useful to talk to my family about, probably. But for their entire life, my children had grown up with a father who was away very regularly, and a wife who was a single mother every time I went away. And I think the consequences of that were major. Not that we didn't come through it, and that I've got the most wonderful children, all three of them, but that there are obviously consequences when father is away a lot. And not just that, but that much of my life is, and especially very significant experiences of what happens on the road, and the people you meet, and the experiences you have, and the audiences, are completely not shared with the people closest to you. It's another world, literally. So the sum total effect of all that, I think, it is quite significant, and there's a big loss of something.
Okay.
And I think it just came to the point of saying, okay, hang on a minute, is this time for something different? And I didn't know where that would lead me until I heard a Dutch lecturer in music therapy, totally unexpected, never even heard of music therapy as a profession, totally got it, as in put the words music and therapy together, it kind of makes sense. But I didn't realise that there was a profession. And I heard her speak, and she changed well, at the end, she ended up changing my life, I suppose, because it was some years later. But she described her experience of working as a music therapist in psychiatric wards of prisons, high security prisons, working with men who quite potentially going to have a life in prison who committed violent crimes. But she described these sessions and the work she did with drumming and all sorts of stuff, and it was riveting. And I remember thinking to myself, this makes such sense. The idea that in some areas of life, people in need, people struggling with this and that, music can be much more than just the enjoyment of listening to something. So to cut this story a bit short, I made the decision some years later to explore music therapy. Found that there was a course very close to home in Bristol. Decided to go on the course. Trained, got my diploma, and started practicing in 2005, I think it was. And yes, a huge change, because step by step, that became and has become my main area of work. And that means, of course, it also means being available. So you can't be a music therapist and say I'm away for 2 months touring. Sorry,
exactly.
I'll be back. So that becomes the priority, the discipline, and then everything else has got to fit into that.
Yeah.
So a huge shift. And the other blessing is that my work is within 10 minutes of my home.
Lovely.
And that was an extraordinary contrast. After all those years, suddenly I step out of the door and I'm in where I want to be in a quarter of an hour.
Yeah, how wonderful. Yeah.
Not to mention the people I work with who are primarily children with special needs, but that has its own massive rewards and challenges.
Both, yes,
and maybe important to just add in this, that it hasn't in any way curtailed the amount of writing I do. What it has done is massively influenced the writing.
Fantastic.
Because you open up new thinking about sound and instruments and textures and colours, and that comes into your own.
In 2006, one of the albums, Well, Every Place is Under the Stars, with Carla, your daughter.
Yeah, my lovely daughter.
And I think, obviously you were recording that while you were a music therapist, early days as a music therapist. And I think you've described it as one of your most joyful works.
Absolutely.
And then some of that came from the Kakamega, I have to pronounce it correctly, came from Kenya, from when you went with your mum to, I think you'd lost your sister, I think, and you went to Kenya.
Yes.
And you recorded that bird singing, and you've used that on the track, on the album.
It's a lovely way you draw that out, really, because as you describe it, you can almost see the therapy aspects come so naturally into the writing process. It was also recorded here. Okay. And I'd never done that before. It was recorded literally next to the garage. I've got a music room.
Fantastic.
And John Birch, the guy that helped me with Instrument Strangers, he got involved with this. Carla, my lovely daughter, who we then, by then we were beginning to discover just what an amazing voice she had.
Yeah.
And ideas around writing. And yes, this trip that was a kind of pilgrimage. My sister had died, but she'd spent time in Kenya, and my mum wanted to go back to the places that she'd been in.
Right.
And then going into the Kakamega rainforest and hearing this unbelievable bird singing its
amazing,
and recording it on my mini disc player and bringing it back and setting it to music, and that's what made it such a joyful experience, because it was an organic process. It was very familiarising using family, and it just felt like, because I can't remember how long it had been since a previous album, but it was having moved into music therapy with the willingness, I think, to give up altogether, like a recording career. All these years later, this album comes so naturally, so joyfully.
Wonderful.
An album I like the pieces on it.
Absolutely.
And a kind of, almost like a restoration of the composer, singer-songwriter, but with all these new influences from his world of music therapy. Yeah. So it was lovely.
So it's, I think you've said in your book that the music therapies help your creativity.
Oh, hugely.
Massively. And that your singer-songwriter days are far from over. Well, we know that because we've got to talk a little bit more. Because, for 2013, Fierce Love was written. Again, Carla was involved, and Jamie. You were
this time really family, absolutely. So you've got Carla singing, significantly singing on the album as a major part, but wonderfully, my son Jamie, who by now was a fully fledged mixer producer, so really up there. He's very, very good at what he does.
Fantastic.
And he came to Bath, and the main location for the recording was my music therapy room up at where I work.
Three-way school.
Which was perfect acoustically, and also the instruments that I have there and all the rest of it.
Right.
So we set up in there, and even more than Every Place is Under the Stars, I suppose what Fierce Love was able to do was to draw in all these textures and actual sounds that I work with every day in the music therapy work. So it was a real coming together of the music therapy influences, of family connections, of themes that had opened up, again, because of the kind of work that I now do. And that sort of further reminder that, you know, I have to be careful about making these claims about myself, but I felt that my songwriting was as strong as ever,
right.
if not stronger, for the other elements that I was able to draw into it.
Okay.
And that's so important to feel that about yourself, that you're actually growing as a writer, as a composer. You're not sort of losing it.
I think you've described it being at the summit of a hill. Instead of climbing up constantly, you felt you were at a summit and going downhill with some new friends, a new experience, a new new way of doing things. And that was sort of very refreshing.
Yes.
And almost like a sort of revelation, I would guess.
Yes, a revelation that, you know, and everybody goes through these things, but a revelation that every chapter, if you're open to what might come next, there will be new things, and they will be positive, or they can be, and that's especially around people, but also around. I think one of the things you learn as a music therapist to increase is your awareness of what's around you.
Right.
It's an increased sensitivity to what you listen to, what you're hearing in a deep sense, not just ears, but, you know, whole body listening in a way.
Okay.
I think that experience increases your spontaneity, your sense of imagination. You're constantly thinking, how can I use that? You know, whether it be a shell on a beach or a branch that looks funny, or something that could generate a sound that maybe nobody else has quite tried to do it that way before. It's that mindset that is a very liberating thing. Right. And I have found that for me has become a big part of who I am now.
It's wonderful. The lost child coming home, you've said, well, your book, of course.
Ooh.
So
lost child, if we ever come home.
If we ever come home, perhaps we're all a little bit
much
like
closer
that
to home. Yeah.
Can we talk about the latest work, Adrian?
Of course.
Yes. What a fantastic! I mean, just opening the album up. Look, you've got 3 CDs with different colours, if nothing else, and there's the man himself. So, I mean, this was some time in making. Yeah. And when did this concept sort of start? You know.
Yeah. So this was a big project for me, and it's recent. So it's like still in that slightly vulnerable stage of you kind of wondering what people really think about it, because not least because of its length. So. The album, which is called Kintsugi, The Art of Precious Scars. So very quickly, Kintsugi is a Japanese word, and it describes an art form which is about the restoration of beautiful pieces of pottery, let's say a vase or a bowl or something, that is broken. And instead of throwing the bits away, it's about reconstructing, but using a gold and glue kind of sealant to remake the piece, so you end up not just with the original bowl, but a bowl that's new, that is made more beautiful because of the scars. Right. When I heard about that concept, I thought, oh my goodness, that's
remarkable.
If ever there was a description of Christian concept of redemption, that's got to be it, you know. And when I first heard about it, years before doing the album, I remember thinking, I've got to work with that whole concept. Right. And from that point onwards, what happened really was that as I was writing, recording, from time to time, I think that belongs to that one day. So there was a gradual collecting of music, of pieces that I thought this will be part of whatever it is the album's going to become. And after 3 years, I think it was, of gathering this material, I realized that I had significantly more than one album's worth. Yeah. And then that gets tricky because you think, well, So do I just basically be very brave and edit it down, get rid of, or is there enough material to say, no, actually, don't just weed out all this stuff, just offer people a lot more material. When it came to it, finally, the recording took place, I was recording all along the way at home, doing my own recordings, and then finally got to the decision, this is it, now I need help, I need a mastering engineer to come alongside me.
Right.
And that's the process then of saying, well, is this worthy of keeping? And when we'd gone through all that process, believe it or not, even with discarding a lot of material, we had 3 albums worth.
Amazing.
And I just couldn't weed out anymore. No. I mean, I'm sure people will say, yes, you could have done.
You've got a lot more. So you've got a lot of more archived, weeded out material somewhere.
There is a lot more, which is it is remarkable. But what the result was, we had to make a decision. That's 3 albums. Do we then release 1 album, let's say every 9 months or year for 3 years?
Okay.
But then I found myself thinking, but the trouble is, if we do that, it'll be 3 years before I feel I can move on.
Yeah.
Because you're saying no longer coming in.
Absolutely right.
And so took the very risky decision in one sense to say, no, we'll release it as a triple album. And that happened earlier this year. It's still early days for me. You remember I said, I think earlier we were talking about needing to be very careful to analyze your own expectations of what you've done and what you've achieved, and try to separate out, in fact, your own expectations from what is realistic. I'm at that stage right now, of trying to work out, what have I done here? Okay. Was it worth the effort? Was it worth 3 albums? What do people think? It's right in that stage right now. Okay,
and I think, as a sort of a fan and as a guy on the outside, I would say it takes some listening. It's it's a huge work.
Yeah.
The instrumentals bind it together beautifully.
That's nice.
They really do, and there's so much power in an emotion in the lyrics and in the music. I think, to be honest, I think you have to give it time. The 3 albums worth, you can only play at it a little bit.
That's the problem, isn't it? Is that we do not live at a time when people do that. And I think that's for me one of the biggest questions around it. For me, is facing up to the reality that very few people sit down and listen to even 1 album in its entirety, let alone 3. It, of course, I was never intending that people would sit down and listen to all 3.
Sure.
But you kind of want people to listen to each one.
Yes, indeed.
But and the hardest realization for me was when I thought, hang on, Adrian, how do you listen to albums? I do the same thing.
You dip in.
Unless somebody has most definitely produced a concept album,
yeah,
and you know that, okay, you need to listen to this in order as it was intended. If it's an album that might have a sort of thematic element to it, and even a bit of conceptual, but if it's not actually built to be, you dip, and not long after you've even bought the album, you create your playlist.
Yeah.
Which is scary, because in that I do that, how can I possibly expect other people not to do that with this? So that, for me, is the remaining dilemma, is that, have I created something where the expectations actually are unrealistic, because people are not going to do it that way. What will the result be? Will the result be that people say, do you know what, I'm sure there'll be stuff on this I'd like, but I'm not going to buy it because it's just too much.
Maybe.
Or do they buy it and quickly make a playlist? In which case, there's probably loads of material I desperately want them to listen to, which they won't. You open up those dilemmas that I haven't resolved. I doubt that I'll ever do that again.
For sure, it's a mammoth. It's an opus almost, isn't it?
It kind of is, and your response is really helpful, because I think that's, in a way, it's exactly what I would hope for. Namely, that you're giving it a chance, that you understand that it takes time. That you're beginning to hear maybe some of the hardest thing of all for me was the response of some of my family to this, because I think that obviously people who are very close to you, that
they're honest.
They're very honest, and they want to be encouraging.
Yes.
But they can't possibly fabricate.
No.
And what I certainly got from family, not all of our family, but what I certainly got was exactly that. Namely, there's so much material, too much to grasp hold of. Even lyrically, now that was an interesting response.
Massive amount of lyrics.
Lyrics are incredibly important to one's album.
Yeah.
But I thought that would be quite a positive thing, but not to everybody. For some people, including within my own little circle of family, too many words.
Okay.
And that's a difficult one because you get into some very tricky, vulnerable territory of, you know, why were you writing that? Who is it for? Blah, blah, blah. So all good learning experience, but work in progress in the sense of this is finished, but what isn't finished is getting some feedback from people.
Right, right. And you've recently been to Prague.
Yeah, oh, wonderful city. Well, that was amazing. That was, again, an invitation out of the blue to go back to a city that I had performed in quite a few times before the Berlin Wall fell. So I have an amazing history with that country, working with people that took quite a few risks in bringing me out there in the days of communism and when overt Christian expression was absolutely forbidden. And they brought me out there, and I forged some beautiful relationships. All of these years later, 30 whatever it is years later, there I was invited to come back for an event that was a reunion of loads of these people who'd been part of that movement at the time. They all came back together to celebrate and to look at their story. Right. And they basically said, would you come as our guest artist? Not difficult to answer that one. I'm on my way.
Wow, how about that? And old friends.
Old friends. In fact, I mean, the amazing thing is the performance location. It's the sort of main Baptist church in the heart of Prague. It's this incredible building, but it is largely hidden. I think it had to be. I think it was almost like when it was properly built, because of the communist atheistic government, they didn't want a strong visual presence of church. Right. So they were allowed to have the church, but you go through this big wooden gate, and then there's a garden there, then's the church.
Okay.
That's where we went. But I went in there, this is just a few months ago, to perform, and I went to exactly the same place, on exactly the same stage. Almost, the piano that I played on is still there, I didn't actually use that. But in the front row, so I'm sitting here performing, and in the front row on this side are three of the people who sat exactly there 30-something years ago when I first went. And I even have a photograph of it. Incredible. So I even have a photograph of exactly these people sitting in exactly the same chairs 35 years ago, before the Iron Curtain fell. Sure. And obviously we're all older and bigger. But it was an extraordinary moment of reminder of gratitude, really, that I was part of that, and that there were people who still wanted to say, you know, we want Adrian, we want his sound, his songs for this occasion. Adrian,
I think you've done us proud today. Thank you so much for the interview.
You're very welcome.
And your music is a great inspiration, and your work with the children I know is as well. So just thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed.
Looks like we got it.
We've got it this time. We've got it this time. And fantastic. Would you be so kind as to play a couple of little small short pieces?
Yeah. We said we'd do that.